Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and final session of the symposium entitled Sports, Politics and Society, which is under the title of Sports as a Space for Resistance, the case of Palestine. We start with Ihab Maharmeh. His paper is entitled The Evolution and Impact of the Sporting Boycott of Israel. He worked at Birzeit University. He has many papers and he is currently editorial secretary to Siyasat Arabiya. And he wrote extensively on the Palestinian workers in Israeli settlements. His paper's title today is The Evolution and Impact of Sporting Boycott of Israel. Ihab, you have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Dr. Ayat. And I have to give the main conclusions in the 20 minutes. I will be discussing on the sporting boycott of Israel from all international events and the Olympics in general and the last 2 decades, refocusing on two main things. First, the protest movement, boycott movement, and the cross-border advocacy by NGOs, and also the boycott at the Arab level. If we follow the 1920, which was held in Antwerp in Belgium, where the first international or major sports event was held with boycott by either individuals or Olympic committees or countries. This, of course, does not necessarily mean that if you use the tool of boycott in one event, this will continue. But although boycotting is a tool by international relations and the international community, by states and non-state actors, so far as the first phase of sporting boycott, in its first phase, this was linked to political disputes between countries from the 1920 Antwerp Olympics until the Rome Olympics in 1960. In this period, boycotting was a tool used by countries to settle political scores. The most important and famous was the campaign by the United States against the Berlin Olympics in 1936 because of the dispute with the Nazi regime. At that time, this was accompanied by wide-ranging mobilization to strip legitimacy from countries, or like what happened in the Helsinki when China was driven out of the international organizations, when China defeated Taiwan and the International Olympics Committee gave China's seat to Taiwan. During this stage, the sports boycotting had a quicker impact, more quicker than economic boycotts, which needed years sometimes. As for the second phase, this phase was distinguished by struggle against colonialism and apartheid and racial discrimination. This continued until the Seoul Olympics, and sporting Olympic in this period was described as one of the most advanced and influential tools in the 20th century. I think this is linked to two things. First, the increase of the number of countries and federations which use boycotting in the Olympics, unlike the first phase where boycotting was linked to influential countries, especially the countries which were victorious in World War One and World War Two, countries with lesser impact like Asian and African countries started using these tools as an expression of their foreign policy and as a way of protestation against some racist countries. And this has led to more using boycotting with the other cases like human rights and anti-colonialism. And the best example was the boycotting of Rhodesia and South Africa from the 60s till the early 90s. And I think the results, the desired results in this phase, when the number of countries who use boycotting increased and the scope and the reasons widened, has consolidated the value of boycotting as an influential tool in international relations. As for the last and final stage, is the stage where started with the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, which continues in brackets until today, and with the International Olympic Committee insisting on avoiding anything to do with politics according to Olympic Charter. And when at the end of the Seoul Olympics 1988, the International Olympic Committee allowed South Africa to take part in the Barcelona Olympics in 1992. But in this phase, the increasing of sport and ability of sport to mobilize politically did not stop international federations of using boycotting as a tool. And what happened in February 2022 when the United States boycotted the Beijing Winter Olympics, and also a number of steps taken by the United States, Europe, and UK against Russia and Belarus in March 2022 because of Russia's war on the Ukraine. What's important for me is the boycotting of Israeli teams in particular, and this increase is different than in nature than other apartheid type regimes that we alluded to. Israel has managed in the second phase managed to avoid being boycotted at the international sporting events, and this boycotting was exclusively practiced against South Africa and Rhodesia. But boycotting Israel was absent from these international events, especially the Olympics, with very exceptions when Indonesia boycotted the Beijing Olympics because of a difference over the participation of Israel. So therefore, all of the above has we lost you for a few minutes. According to that, I decided to discuss why in the third stage there was an increase in boycotting Israel, and this is what this paper focuses on. And when the cross-border advocacy and civil society organizations contributed in a major way, the paper considers this as main factor and main actor in different aspects, maybe the sporting one being the most prominent, and an attempt to explain how these movements work, because they are not strong in the traditional sense, because they rely on the strength of information and ideas to convey them to advocacy organizations in other countries abroad, which are linked to governments and their policies. I think what adds to the importance of this model is when they were allowed to be more visible in the international scene more than before. There may be four pillars that these movements rely on in their work. First is the policy of information, which means the ability of convey information which can be used politically. Secondly, the ability to use symbols. Thirdly, the forcing countries to reveal their policies. And fourthly, a policy of applying pressure and pressurizing companies, governments, and states. And according to these four pillars, we'll find that the boycotting movements relied mainly on spreading information, statements regularly, and holding meetings with cross-border advocacy agencies and civil society organizations. As for the symbols, the main symbols employed, which were mentioned in their founding statement, is the link between the apartheid regime in Palestine and apartheid regime in South Africa. This movement also force companies, international companies, to reveal their contacts with Israel. Finally, the movement opens relations and links with NGOs and civil society organizations to make them apply pressure on their companies which deal with Israel. And this way of looking at this issue, although it may be helpful to make us understand and how the sectors are different sectors are used in boycotting Israel, including sports, we also must mention that after 2011 in the Olympics and Paralympics, so an increase in the way of boycotting Israel, and with many athletes, Arab athletes, whether individual or group, they use different techniques in refusing to engage in competitions with Israeli athletes, and use different tactics to impact their counterparts internationally to make them boycott Israel. And despite the Arab boycotting of Israel is not something new, the Arab countries have taken a decision in expelling Israel from the Asian Federation in 1994. But the question remains that the entire affair depends on each different country and their relations with Israel. For this reason, the boycotting was at the continental level and not the international level. In my opinion, the opportunities like the Arab revolutions have opened the way to more interpretation and explanation, and the logic here shows that the Arab revolutions have impacted the dynamics of boycotting Israel and helped improve them by opening more opportunities and impacted the dynamics, and in view of this it became apparent how the boycotting movement repositioned itself again, benefiting from the fact that the presence of boycotting is very important with the average people, and there is before the movement was established, there have been calls at the popular level to boycott Israel, and the movement has relied on this, and we see indications that in the last decade the positioning is of an Arab nature, and the movement is starting movements, sub or chapters or sub movements in most Arab countries. Before 2011, they only supported one group in the Lebanon, and in the last decade, the movement has been issuing statements in Arabic and other language. Before that, in the in between 2005 to 2010, only 6 statements were issued in Arabic, and afterwards more than 200 and in different languages. So therefore, the Arab Revolution has led to improving the movement's work, and I think sporting boycotting is a manifestation of boycotting in general, and it's used at the Arab level with the Olympics, especially where Arabs and Israelis can meet, and whoever wants to use this politically is make themselves liable for punishment. And this space, which is as a sport as a space, is viewed in this manner, and we can go by the different tactics which became apparent in the last decade from Tunisia, Algeria, Iraq, and other countries, used by clubs and individuals, especially with countries whose governments signed normalization agreements with Israel. And also we see the growing impact on Israel and its companies as a result of Arab sporting personalities and clubs. And the next part of this paper, I discuss different tactics which became apparent in the Olympics which were not present before. First, boycotting Israel and their teams at the Olympic level, whereas the large percentage of Arab athletes in the past used to use the pretext of having an injury to avoid competing with Israeli athletes and to avoid punishment. Lately, we saw a new phenomenon, and that is Arab athletes announcing publicly and without any pretext or excuses, and also some athletes were pressurized by their local federations to when they refused handshaking Israeli athletes. Maybe the best example is what the members of the Egyptian judo team did in the last 5 years. The second point, and that is boycotting Israeli companies which sell their products in the Olympics. And Israel has more than 650 companies in this field. There have been campaigns by Arab athletes and sporting clubs calling people everywhere in the world to boycott Israeli products. The last in this was to boycott the number of the electronic system invented by an Israeli company to register the number of attendees to matches. Thirdly, boycotting the countries and which support Israel, and lately we saw campaigns by Arab athletes and clubs to against the sponsorship deals received by athletes from Israeli companies and international companies, and the example of that is to end contracts with Adidas and Puma because of the sponsorship of Israeli sporting events and sponsor events in Israeli occupied settlements. Also, another example, and because of pressure by the boycotting committee and other sources, in October 2011, the Swedish Federation cancelled an international match with the Israeli team in Israel. And I'll try to conclude here. According to some Arab athletes who boycotted Israel, the realization that using sporting boycotting was not not feasible without the Arab revolutions. And the proof of that is the Arab athletes in the last decade started viewing sporting boycotting as a space for them, and also they know that their political stance will be met with with high levels of interest, and also in the absence of official boycotting of Israel, the level at the individual and club level is an opportunity to compensate for that, and this is known as the race for boycotting Israel, and which makes it apparent how these opportunities enriched boycotting and its tools and made the Arab athletes active players in the boycotting movement. It's true that this boycotting has not reached the level in the first and second phases, which I alluded to in the beginning of this paper, but we cannot ignore the impact caused by the boycott by Arab athletes and clubs and their influence into at the international level. Finally, if it wasn't for Israel's feeling that boycotting it is a direct threat to Israel and to its companies, we wouldn't have seen Israel taking some unprecedented and unusual policies to minimize the impact of this boycotting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ihab, for this enriching paper and for abiding by the time. Ibrahim Rabaia is our next panelist. He works at the Palestinian Center for Research, and he's a graduate of the Malaya University in Malaysia, and he's a coach at the FIFA and the Center for Long Learning. He worked as a coordinator of planning in the international cooperation at the Ministry of Planning in Palestine, and he has a number of research papers, and he'll be talking about the sports establishment in occupied Palestine between the years of 1967 and 1995. Thank you, Dr. Iyad. Thank you, colleague Ihab. In fact, I'd like through this paper to look at the sports establishment in the OPT following the 1967.
and the role of this at the social level and the Israeli imperial hegemony, sport was present at its early stages through the participation in the Zionist movement with the registration of the Palestinian Federation FIFA in the 1920s, and at that time there were only a very limited number of clubs, and the subsequent team which was formed had no more than two Arab members, and this led to continuous confrontation by the Palestinian National Movement with FIFA and with Britain and other countries. Also, the Zionist movement has utilized the Maccabi clubs, which used to represent Jews in the world, and they used to organize international tournaments. 1935, for example, the tournament led to the entering into Palestine 20,000 armed Jewish young men and women who were the backbone of the Haganah fighting militia later on. So this was the cover for unauthorized immigration into Palestine and was the backbone for the Haganah, which took part in the Nakba directly and openly. After 1967, sport was not an exception, definitely, and Israel started practicing or attempting to practice its total hegemony. And despite the feeling that they had total hegemony in the early years, the Palestinians, according to Dr. Majdi al-Maliki, started adapting and by way of resistance to this phenomena, this kind of adaptation based on resistance led the effort, and before 1967 at the level of sport there was two formations, one in Gaza, one the West Bank, because of the West Bank's link to Jordan and Gaza's link to Egypt, and there was a level of organization with Jordan, and in Gaza the Palestinian sporting movement had a degree of independence through federations and teams and clubs, took part in the Arab Cup, which was the last participation of Palestine, with a team mostly made up of Gazan players before 1966. And some Palestinian federations managed to get some international recognition at the level of basketball, but so far as football is concerned, the FIFA did not accept repeated Palestinian attempts and under different pretexts. With the FIFA did not accept to deal with messages coming from Gaza as part of the Palestinian state, because they considered Gaza as an area or a strip, not a state. After 67, we saw three phases. The first, the restoring of activity after the shock of the setback of 1967, and through restoring sporting activity, especially in Nablus, and they started organizing tournaments. The Israeli occupation was restricting this kind of activities, and there were the formation of teams at the local level, which they then afterwards developed into the level of federations and organizing committees with the military rule, which really assigned an officer to keep an eye on this movement. So this period also saw a degree of organization in the northern parts of the West Bank, in Gaza, and in the middle and southern parts of the West Bank, like the Supervising Committee, the Union of Arab Clubs, and the Federation of Southern Clubs. They were very weak formations because they did not have enough representation. In this phase, there were other solutions by the clubs to activate the sporting movement through so-called al-sawa'aq or lightning tournaments, which were held on certain ceremonial occasions through some clubs, and then this became an annual tradition until Oslo. The second phase, which spanned specifically between 1979 and 1984, and this is the period where some sort of an institutionalization has taken place. They were keen not to use any traditional sporting names like a federation or committee, and this is for a very good reason, and that is Israel may not be using that to include and annex that to the Israeli federations and things. Of course, the West Bank preceded Gaza, and this was in 1980 by establishing the federations in both places. And this was in order to achieve some degree of coordination between the West Bank and Gaza, and there was an attempt to have similar articles of association and organizing system and rules and regulations, and the federations of the West Bank and Gaza coordinated, and they had a joint organizing committee, and they managed to hold like a tournament between teams from both places. And the first General League in Palestine in 1980, and a preliminary one first, and then one based on some sort of ranking. And the third stage is the political presence of sporting organizations in the occupied territories, which came after 1983-84. And this period is largely ignored in the context of studying the preparation for the Intifada, because the federation was a place of incubation for activities which led to the Intifada. But now we have a new group of citizens who are the youth who engaged in voluntary work, which was the cover for political mobilizations through these clubs. Also, the matches provided a cover for the symbols of the Intifada to move from one city to another, which is very difficult, let alone moving between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Even to move to attend a match, the spectators were only allowed to go to the stadiums. Anybody who went outside would be arrested, but the symbols of the national movement used this opportunity to coordinate their efforts between Gaza and the West Bank, and this was part of the process of adaptation through resistance. After 1982, and in this phase, the municipalities were disbanded, and there was there was the need for some sort of organization. So clubs became the form of providing services for like education, health, and infrastructure. Also, there is a this what explains the increase in the number of clubs from 60 to some 260 because these clubs were organizations using sport as a cover to engage in political activity directly. Gaza in the 80s was in direct contact with the occupied territory and the PLO, Occupied Territories Organization, and the PLO, especially after the expulsion of PLO from Beirut. And it's said that one of the leaders of the federation in Gaza was arrested and for 68 days and put in a refrigerator for 3 days to force him to reveal how he was maintaining contacts with the national movement and transferring funds. The clubs allowed for developing a youth movement which was transferred into a widespread popular movement and incubators, active incubators for like the youth committees, which what later on became the youth organization committees. The martyr Muhammad Abu Matkur was a famous personality, and in Rafah, Abu Ali Shaheen started the club in Rafah, and the club was closed for 10 years by the Israeli occupation. Also, Abu Matkur, one of the well-known stories is he sold his private car to fund the National Assembly's meeting in Amman in 1984, which was the National Assembly held under difficult circumstances after the PLO's expulsion from Beirut. In the second half of the 1980s, some clubs were closed for 10 years, and some athletes were targeted while they are on the pitch. Jamal Shweiki was targeted and martyred when a number of the Israeli units undercover who operate under the disguise of wearing Arab attires, and they killed him on the pitch, on the grounds of the stadium. And after that, sports personalities engaged in the national movement, and Israel noticed that and closed all the clubs, and some were arrested, like Ayman Sanduqa, who was the striker of the national team and the coach of the Palestinian youth team. He was arrested from the stadium and imprisoned for 16 years. Israel also used to continuously interrogate and arrest and intimidate the officials of the clubs, and the West Bank, they used to be held in a detention center called Al Far'a. After Oslo, this was transferred into a youth city and some players, and this on its own is some kind of a symbolism, and the sporting personalities became activists later in the places where they were held and detained. And also Israel used to fire some members when they say that they violated the rules and regulations, and sometimes arrest them, not just sack them. Some of the important events was the arrest of 65 Palestinians in a center in Calandia for watching a nationalist film, and also storming the Al Yarmouk Stadium, where there were tens of thousands of spectators, and the pretext of one spectator out of the few thousand had a gun.
Yes, indeed. The club represents the community, and in the Dahisha camp in the southern part of the West Bank, next to Bethlehem, a number of officers met the dignitaries of the camp, and they wanted to have a truce with the camp, but the youngsters who represented the center said that we are representative of the camps, and the dignitaries cannot speak on our behalf, and the meeting has been a failure, and one of the youngsters were exiled to Jordan. The club plays a role in elections as well, because they represented the different parties in Silwan, in Jerusalem, in Dahisha, and in the competition between the factions of the PLO, Fatah, and the Popular Front. And these competitions were neck to neck, and the West Bank usually used to watch what goes on. The Silwan club is very famous, and it usually have the attire whereby the jerseys carry the Palestinian flag. And up to this moment, when Silwan plays against a Gaza club, it represented a political festival, and the clubs were keen on organizing matches in Jerusalem, followed by demonstrations, and often following the matches, demonstrations will be organized to support the PLO, especially when it was besieged in 1982 in Beirut. As far as security in the Palestinian stadia at the time was better than today's, because we have kind of self-censorship in the past, and the sporting movement has been more valuable. There was also there were different centers that played a role in hosting the youngsters at night, and the figures of the liberation movement under the light of candles to prepare for next day's movements. With the advent of the Intifada, the uprising, we or popular kind of places were surfacing, and the popular committees organized the daily life of the inhabitants of Gaza and the West Bank, and represented an internal kind of national pattern away from the Israeli intervention. The popular committees were the heirs of the charitable organizations. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. We will open the floor to receive questions, please. Could you introduce yourself, please? Firas Al-Qawasbi, I'm a researcher, post-doctorate researcher. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for this intervention. You've said that there are 3 phases following 1967, and correct me if I'm wrong. The first phase was up to 1982 or 79, and then from 82 to 84, and then you said that in the West Bank and Gaza the joint kind of links were activated in 1982, especially when it comes to the associations that were activated in the villages. So what's the reason for that? Do you think that the sporting kind of related activities at the time of the village associations was a fact? Second question is to do with the political terms of reference or the political authorities. How such committees, sporting committees, how did they resort to the PLO? Was there a support funneled to them by the PLO? The last question is to do with the rules of associations of such clubs. So how the head of a certain club would be voted for? Was he kind of legitimized, or his position was legitimized from the populace? A question to Dr. Ihab, if he can hear us. Yes, he's with us. My question: is there a boycott to Israel, but there is a reaction on the part of the Israelis? I am an activist as well in Lebanon, and I work in the MMA, and one Lebanese fighter boycotted the Israeli opponent, and Israeli lawyers in London lodged a case and said that this ought to not have happened, because you should not discriminate your opponent, you should compete with anyone, and the MMA Federation might threaten Lebanon. If this happens again, then the Lebanese team will be banned from participating. So do you take this issue into consideration? And sport in Israel is being developed greatly. They're trying kind of to snooker us, to corner us. Have you taken this into consideration? Thank you. Majd Abu Amir, I'm a researcher. Thank you for Ibrahim and Ihab, my 2 friends, for this intervention. I would like to ask Ihab, is there a relationship between the BDS and boycotting the Israeli opponents? Is there an overlap? And what's the link? How can we build on such efforts? because some athletes who refused to play against the Israelis, some of them, their careers become kind of or ends. And I'd like to ask about the normalization kind of efforts with the Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain. I think Israel has been accommodated. Saudi Arabia in the judo in Tokyo, Al-Qahtani, a female judo player, played against an Israeli. And last question, as far as boycotting the Russians, perhaps the Palestinians can uh, uh, look at this matter and have a parallel kind of deduction, because some or the Russians have been boycotted, but nothing has happened to their opponents. And as far as the literature is concerned, some talk about resisting the colonialist powers. And why have we stopped at 1995? And what is the legacy of such period? And what's the role of sport in the Intifada? Yes, it has been accustomed and it has survived. And the clubs have hosted national figures. But what about the spectators, the fans, and mobilization efforts? In Gaza in 2006, Hamas understood the importance of sport, and they built kind of playing grounds next to the mosques. So tell us about the role of such efforts. Thank you. My questions overlap with Majd's, but as far as Ihab's paper is concerned, I would have loved to have some data, some statistics, especially as far as the boycotting efforts are concerned, to tell us about the players, their nationalities, and I agree that the BDS perhaps played a role in kind of understanding the choices of the players themselves. And Dr. Ibrahim, we need to understand the legacy of such sport, and you've talked about the identity, you've talked about the players themselves, but when we talk about Palestinian sport and the role of resistance, this is my question. Thank you. Thank you for these two important papers and allowing a space to talk about the Palestinian sport. I think this is important. I would like to address Ihab. Do you think that the Munich Olympics and the Black September and has been perhaps exploited by Israel in order to change the rhetoric of defining the victim and the prosecutor? There is also another example, the Israeli impact is not that seen, especially when it comes to the Mediterranean competitions. Israel wanted to become a member, but it did not succeed. So is this to do with certain decisions that are taken by the Arabs to elbow aside Israel? Dr. Ibrahim, yes, in addition to the challenges that you've talked about internally, there are challenges that perhaps make or impact the dynamism of Palestinian sport internationally, especially the Palestinians within the Israeli borders, because some of them represent Israel, and they say that because they represent us, then there is no apartheid. And we've seen a club that represented Israel internationally. I mean, the Sakhnin club. And what about the diaspora and the camps outside the OPT? Talk about Jordan, talk about different countries whereby Palestinians play for the other national teams. And there are also other Arab countries that host certain tournaments, and perhaps refusing the participation of Israel might not serve them, especially using sport for marketing and emphasizing the international relations. Thank you. Last question. Thank you very much, Ihab and Ibrahim, for their papers. The idea of resistance and boycotting is an idea that propels us to talk about the sociology of hooliganism and protests and ultras and so on and so forth. So I wonder about the identity of the protesters. Is it a societal kind of movement, a community-based movements, or are they just protests? And do we think that these movements were able to establish a religious or national inclination? And what about utilizing the digital space? We do understand that the world has been transformed into becoming a digital and real-time communication and so on and so forth. What is the impact of the digital world on the resistance movements? Has it been used in a prudent kind of fashion? Last question to Mr. Ihab. The Palestinian resistance movements and the relationship with the political parties. Can we talk about cooperation between the two? Because the resistance kind of movements are voluntary kind of movements, and they don't kind of deal with politics per se. So what is the relationship between the resistance movements and the other Palestinian political factions, Fatah, Hamas? The second paper from Mr. Ibrahim It is indeed a splendid paper. I have only one question. You've talked about the institutionalized sport and the role of resisting the occupation. I think that the popular or the disorganized sport might have more impact on the Israeli entity. Last comment. Thank you. I would like to just link Nassif's and Ihab's papers. Nassif talked about the soft power, and Ihab said that this soft power relates to two powers, the military and the economic. The military and economic power of Europe led to the activation of the sport-related power, because boycotting Russia is legal. However, boycotting Israel is illegal, and the difference is the relationship between the soft power that lacks the economic and military power. And that's why we have a problem. We wonder what can we do. However, the Europeans did not pose this question. They said Russia is boycotted, and that's it. So the soft power on its own is not effective. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mordi. The last question. Thank you. I would like just perhaps to correct. The Sakhnin is an Arab team that represents the Palestinian cause. So it is a resistant kind of move to support the Palestinians inside Israel. And the second issue is the Palestino club in Chile, which represents a good support to the Palestinian cause, especially in Latin America. And those who go back to the establishment of the Palestino Chile, it has been established by the Palestinians themselves in Chile, and Israel was in uproar when this club wore jerseys that put Palestine as historical Palestine from the river to the sea. Thank you. There is also an observation. You've started with in 1967, and if there were certain information about the Palestinians who live in Israel, then we might have answered a number of questions. The other issue is being touched upon by Mr. Majd, there is the role of mosques in the sporting activities since the 90s. The PLO in Palestine and the civil kind of frames were responsible for sporting activities. Now, mosques play a role in this regard. So, as for Ihab, align myself with those who asked about understanding these outcomes. As you said, the Arab Revolution 2011 played a major role in cementing the BDS activities. And how do you see the role of the BDS inside Palestine? Thank you for the questions. As far as the associations of the villages, this has related to the increasing numbers of the clubs who played a role in the community. Was there a link with the PLO? Yes, definitely. The sporting movement inside Palestine had its links with the PLO and the Joint Committee and the Ministry of the Affairs of the Occupied Territories in Jordan. And this link has been kind of a covert link rather than an overt link with the PLO. Yes, rules of associations were there. I can say that the Ma'arif journal in Israel in the 80s published an article that says the association of clubs in the West Bank and Gaza is a full-fledged ministry, including the regulations, the bylaws, the rules of associations, and even the lists of the names of players used to be put in a bag or a handbag carried by the secretary, lest they can be confiscated. So even the Ottoman rules were applied. From there was Al Ahli Gaza and another Israeli team from Ashkelon. There was an offer for these two clubs to play against each other, and the debts will be written off of the municipality in Gaza, but this was refused, obviously. Why 1967? Because in this year, the Ministry of Youth and Sport supplanted the Association of the Villages. As far as the mosques are concerned, in the 80s and the 70s, they played a role, and we had kind of mosques leagues, and those who represent the mosques were the heroes of the West Bank in ping pong, for example, because inside the mosque, youngsters used to play ping pong. the nature of resistance reached its peak in 1987. But before that, there was a state of resistance-related adaptation. The athletes and sportsmen and women understood that there was an Israeli campaign to attract the Palestinians to work in Israel and to inundate Palestinian territories with drugs. And sports played a major role in fortifying the Palestinians. The associations have ended in 1967, and the ministry came along, but the role has been kind of different. There are some clashes, some players are arrested, and this is continuing, and some matches are being targeted by gas bombs and so on and so forth. And by the way, in 1969, the Higher Sports Council was established with the support of the Arab countries. Israel has been kicked out from the Asian Federation, and the efforts were headed by Kuwait. Israel used to have achievements under the umbrella of the Asian Federation, but the Arab efforts headed by Kuwait led to the expulsion of Israel. Ihab, 5 minutes. Okay, I'll try to answer most of the questions. I agree with Dr. Nassif. In my paper, I spoke about the main challenges encountered by the boycotting of sport, and boycotting related Fatih Nourin, the Algerian, and Ammar bin Yakhlaf, his coach, were banned from participating in any competitions for 10 years. That means ending the career. The challenges are still there, and they didn't stop at the punishments and the fines, and there is the pressures that the Arab players are subject to from their own federations, national federations. I think in 2016, The Egyptian Olympic Committee apologized to Israel because of boycotting the Israeli opponents and rebuked Islam Shihabi, the judo player, when he refused shaking the hands of an Israeli opponent. So the challenges do not stop at the sanctions leveled by the International Olympic Committee, but on the national level as well. But still, we have numerous cases of sports-related boycotting. Second question came from Majd and Saja when they talked about the BDS. I didn't say that this has developed because of the BDS efforts. Sports-related boycotting was before the establishment of the BDS. What I said is that the moment of the Arab Spring compelled the BDS to reposition itself from thinking of liaising with the transborder networks to move into the Arab countries. So the situation has been different. And the Arab revolutions have changed the conduct of the BDS. So the BDS reacted, but it was not the main actor. This clarification is important, and if I wasn't clear enough, then I do apologize. I think that the Munich incident, yes, Israel exploited that issue to tarnish the reputation of the Palestinians and the Palestinian sports. However, the International Olympic Committee, up until 2020, this issue has been debated at length so that the International Olympic Committee can allocate a 1 minute silence over those Israelis who were killed. In 2020, in Tokyo, which was organized virtually, the Olympic Committee allowed for the athletes to stand for 1 moment of silence. But still, Israel has failed to convince the Olympic Committee of any other demands. Israel is not a member of the Mediterranean Games. Palestine also. So boycotting has been detrimental to us in these kind of games. Are we talking about religious or community-based BDS? BDS is not a religious one. It is a local network that overlaps with other networks, and it is not religious. As far as the digital space is concerned, this is not the main issue of my paper, but BDS plays a role digitally, yes. I hope that the BDS should work locally in Palestine as it did in the Arab world. I hope that the BDS would focus on working inside Palestine. The last point, and it is to do with the chance that relates to the Ukrainian dossier. This is very important, and I think it wasn't feasible for the African and Asian countries in the 60s of last century up to the 90s. It was not feasible to use sporting boycott as a tool against the apartheid had it not been for the victors of the World War II to use that. And we Palestinians and Arabs, we couldn't have used the same tool had it not been for such accumulation of using the boycotting tools against the apartheid. So I think the Ukrainian issue will lead to developing the sporting boycott. The sporting boycott will still face challenges. However, I think that the Ukrainian dossier will lead to a push to provide us with another opportunity to talk about this issue. And the Egyptian judo player said that as you allowed yourselves to boycott Russia and Belarus, we also demand to boycott the apartheid Israeli occupation. Thank you, Ihab, and thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you all.